Well, good evening and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM. Hussein Ahmed, the CEO, founder of Yorkville Asset Management, has joined us before a couple of weeks ago before, frankly, this crisis got nearly as big as it has been. And I guess this, Hussein, was after the federal government came out with their very first plan that a couple of days, you said wasn't big enough. And then a couple of days later, actually, you must have known something. The federal government took their wage plan from a 10% wage subsidy, 75% wage subsidy. So you were certainly right in that regard. Anyway, I wanted to check back with you. It's been, almost a month now since we chatted last, and find out, number one, what you think about the economy, where people should be investing or de-investing, and what you think about the federal government response. So Hussein Ahmed, Yorkville Asset Management, thanks for joining us. How are you?
How are you? Good. Doing well. Thank you.
Working from home, I presume.
Yeah, we're all working from home. We're all trying to stay healthy and safe. And, working from home is not a prison. It's actually staying safe. So it's a good thing for people to do if they
Excellent.
can.
So tell me, what's your assessment of the market today?
Well, I'll start first with the fiscal stimulus that we talked about last time. I mean, obviously, now the amounts have increased substantially, and that not just the dollar amount have increased, but also the use of these money has changed. So whether the dollar amount changing who qualifies, for example, for unemployment insurance, that definition is important because Canada, for example, same as the US, and we tend to talk a lot more about the US because it's reflective of global economy, but Canada and the US are in the same boat. They're built on small businesses, sole proprietorship. These are not people on an employment check, so they cannot go claim unemployment the usual way.
Yeah.
So expanding the definition allows a lot of people to participate in these programs. But what does it mean? That the funds are being drawn at a faster rate than probably any previous model that the government was looking at. So first of all, in terms of the money is adequate and is increasing. And from the talks that we're listening to the news, we feel our view, people are turning around to our view that this is a deeper type of crisis. It's not a recession in the traditional sense. It could be another Great Depression that rivals what we've seen in the 1920s, early 30s. But the difference today is government response to that. So we might not have as a prolonged severe impact, assuming COVID-19 is controlled, as we did in the 1920s, 1930s. So we expect the amounts to continue increasing and expansion of these programs. We've seen now in the US, for example, that small business financing loan program is already used up. 430 billion is already used up, almost, I think that's 70% drawn down on it. I would suspect the same numbers are in Canada in terms of the utilization rate. So the government will be forced to look into it, that if this is going to continue into the month of May and well into June, that they need to increase those numbers. So we're in massive contraction. The economy is contracting quicker than probably the original estimates in January and February. And government finances has to step up to close that gap. So that's what's happening.
Hussein,
yeah.
You were saying that you think this is worse than a recession. It is close to a depression comparable to the 1920s. Is that correct?
Yes.
Seriously, a depression?
Yeah, I mean, it is in a classical definition of economic contraction. If you remove the government component of it, what we're seeing in terms of the economic contraction, GDP contracting by 20-30%. Now, the government is stepping in to bridge that gap. So on numbers might not look like it is a Great Depression, but it is it is like that. Think about the number of people that are staying at home, businesses that are shut down, the number of people collecting unemployment insurance. They're going to rival those of the late 20s, early 30s, for sure.
Well, that's a fairly scary proposition, but probably right. We're going to take a break for a message and come back with Hussein Ahmed from Yorkville Asset Management in just a minute. More on the economy. Stay with us.
Anything?
Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM. We are here with Hussein Ahmed, the CEO and founder of Yorkville Asset Management, a money management asset management company here in Toronto and across Canada. Hussein is one of the smartest gentlemen I've met from an economic standpoint. Hussein, so what you're saying is that that we're in not recession, but almost depression kind of territory from an economic standpoint, that without the government fiscal stimulus, we'd be a lot worse. What do you think of the government stimulus? Has it been enough? Is there going to be a lot more? What's your prediction there?
Certainly, I don't think it's enough, but for this stage that we're in, it is sufficient and rightly directed at the areas that are in need. But obviously, as this closure cycle continues for the next few weeks and few months, and there is discussions that this might last 2 years, in the absence of a vaccine of some sort, obviously the government has to continue to step up. Now, the fortunate part for us in Canada and the US is that government debt as a percentage of GDP is at a relatively low point. So we have the capacity to almost double all these programs that are currently in place without having to really start worrying about things that people worried about in the 80s, hyperinflation, all that stuff. Today, the biggest problem is unemployment and bankruptcies. These are two problems that we have to deal with. People sitting at home not collecting paychecks, and at the same time, the bankruptcy of small businesses. And I believe last time we talked about it, me and you, once a small business go bankrupt, it's hard to rebuild that entrepreneurial drive or to get a business owner to invest again and restart the business.
Yeah, let's unpack this conversation a bit. So first of all, you're saying that we have enough debt capacity to double the current programs, because you're saying Canada and the United States, our government debt to GDP is low. How do I connect that to comments that we've had from political parties in the past that our government spending is way too high, that we're Ontario is the second most indebted sub-national government in the world. You're saying our debt to GDP is low, and yet, I think the perception people have is that the government debt and deficit are way too high. How do I connect those two?
Absolutely. Under normal conditions, when economy is working and generating certain output level, you got to measure that debt level in that context. But in the context of a massive contraction, it's easy to talk about balanced budgets, all that stuff when economy is working under normal conditions. The reality is, in the whole system of collecting taxes is to be prepared for days like those are coming, where the economy is weak and now the government needs to spend. And the government ability to spend is in two ways: either borrowing, which is the debt of the government itself, or actually printing money. Now, they're talking about different ways to avoid the concept of printing money. So, for example, allowing companies to go back and claim the losses that they incurred in 2020 against previous profits that they made the past 10 years. So that there's many things that they can do to generate that profitability number and having companies avoid or reclaim the taxes. And that's how the system is originally designed.
Right.
So the government has to step in this environment. And interesting, while we're talking, I'm watching my Bloomberg, and there's an article just popped up, 10:06. It says the IMF sees great lockdown recession as worse since the Great Depression. So once people come to that realization in the government, I think it's easier for us to get out of this economically. If we are in a state of denial and we let political views hamper our solution, it's going to be very painful exercise to get out of this economic challenges.
So second issue you talked about was unemployment. Where do you think the unemployment levels are going? And, one of the things that this whole wage subsidy that the federal government put in place, 75% wage subsidy up to a certain max, was in the hopes that people wouldn't lay people off and we wouldn't have unemployment, and it would be easier and faster for companies to restart again. Is your sense that companies are taking advantage of the wage subsidy, or are they still laying people off?
I think there is three types of companies out there. There's companies that will apply to the program and they rightfully deserve that program and will utilize it to continue to provide those services. There is companies that will take advantage of this program because simply the fact they qualify for it, and because the underwriting criteria is almost non-existent at this stage. And then there's the third, where companies would decide that, hey, either I don't qualify or it doesn't actually help me and my business, and I gotta find another way around it. So there's different reactions from different people on this. Companies in the healthcare space or businesses like us, we would not qualify because we make money. So while I look in the US, for example, hedge fund managers are applying for all these grants. So it really depends how the program is administered. I'm not familiar yet exactly with how the government of Canada plans to get those programs out to the market. In the US, they're using the banking system to provide these free loans almost, or grants to everybody, but they're also getting some sort of a guaranteed repayment or getting some warrants on some of these companies. In Canada, it's a little bit unclear for me as how do they plan to roll that out without ever getting some of that money back.
So my sense is that a lot of companies are still just laying people off, that the wage subsidy, 75%, is 75%. It's not 100%, and it's only up to a cap. And so there's a fair amount of employees that are above that cap. And if you lay people off, you laid them off. And then also I hear, announcements day after day of people that are furloughing employees. So is it working?
I think it works up to a certain number of people. If you're a small business operator, a restaurant operator, or something that the odds of you using that program is very little because you're not even allowed to be open. So somebody giving you 70% of a payroll, but you still have to come up with the 30 when during shutdown. You're not going to use that program. It's not really beneficial. It's only beneficial for businesses that are allowed to continue operating. They operate, but at a much reduced scale. So the 70% counterbalance that reduced scaling down of revenue. But some businesses, I talk to a lot of business owners, and we have many car dealers, for example, that we talk with. So well, it doesn't matter if you pay me 70%. If I'm getting zero, I still got to carry that 30%. And if this is going to go on for 6 months, that's quite a bill for me to carry. So some businesses, that's really doesn't go to help them whatsoever. What they need to do is a similar program to that in the US, where the US government is creating circular theory of money, creating a leverage on 400 billion become 3 trillion, using it almost like a loan program for these businesses where there is very little underwriting. And they're using the term loan, but in fact, it's a grant for the business, provided it doesn't go to the business owner's pocket. Like you cannot build wealth out of it, but it's a grant to pay overhead. As long as you're paying your mortgage, your loan interest, your employees, it doesn't matter as long as you pay it. It generates a revenue stream to keep the business going. In that case, the business owner is indifferent between keeping an employee or firing them. In a situation where you say, I'm going to give you a wage subsidy, many of the business saying, but I got to come up with the 30%, but I'm shut down for the next 3 months. No, thank you. In my business, it's so easy for me to find a waiter or a bartender or a cook or a delivery person. Labor is available. I'm not going to pay that 30%. So that's why the program has benefits for some businesses, but it cannot be applied across the entire economy.
Well, and one of the criticism that I've heard of late is that development stage companies, tech companies, green tech companies, biotech companies that may, maybe pre-revenue or small revenue can't qualify.
Absolutely. The reality is that if you got to take a look at payroll and some of the numbers that they're asking for, a massive sector of technology, finance, even real estate development companies, they would not qualify under these programs. And so they're not going to be beneficiaries of it.
So from a statistical standpoint, where do you think unemployment will end up being in, Q2 of this year, and how does that compare to either 2009 and the 1920s?
I think in 2009, we almost hit 10% unemployment. So definitely in this cycle, we see it hitting that number and larger than that number. Most probably going to be around the 2030. Would it last for the entire year? I cannot tell you that because it all depends on uh, a development of a vaccine or the plans to reopen the economy. But definitely it's going to be higher than that of 2008. It seems that in terms of the application and even now, employers who keep employees, they might not do temporary unemployment or laying them off. But one option we had in 2008, I was at that time working for a financial institution where they came in and said, everybody gets a pay cut, 30%. You have no choice. If you don't want it, you're welcome to be unemployed. Everybody, so there is multiple things that are going to happen that even if unemployment doesn't spike to that 30, payroll, you got to take a look at also the payroll number. You're going to see the payroll numbers drop. So the income and wealth of individuals is going to deteriorate quite substantially between now and the end of the year.
And, taking a mandatory 20 or 25 or 30% payroll cut, even for people that are reasonably well off, it has a huge impact. It impacts their mortgage payment ability, their payment of other debts, their desire to invest, everything.
Absolutely. I got to remember that we're all planning for retirement. And technically, most people, after a certain expense level, a lot of that money goes towards retirement or helping an elderly person. So that amount that goes away, first of all, wipes out your retirement planning, wipes out any support that you give to an elderly or a person that's dependent on you, and then starts into your own expenses. And some of the expenses are quite variable, so you can change them, but some are relatively fixed. Unless we start seeing the banks approving mortgage deferral payments to go hand in hand with that. And I probably suspect if this continues into June, we will start seeing more aggressive plans from the government to help the Canadian not just generate income, but actually delay the expenses that they can. Because you can't keep printing money forever. One way around it is to say to people, hey, for the next 4 months, don't pay your mortgages. For the next 4 months, if you have a loan payment, you can suspend the loan payments. And many Canadians have a large amount of debt. And if they can do this, they don't have to give money. It just delays the collection of these payments. So I would suspect other form of stimulus to come in that way. Just the first reaction is people need money very quickly, and that's what the government did. The second reaction is, hey, we have a massive spike in unemployment. How do we slow it down? They put a very quick program in place. It's great for many businesses, but not so effective in many others. So then they'll start dealing with the problem. But the bigger problem is Canadians' expenses are just too high, and the bulk of them are debt related.
And unemployment has an impact beyond just the numbers that we talked about. It in the 2009 crisis, I remember reading several articles that said that people who were just graduating from schools, if they miss out on that first year, they don't miss out just out on salary, but they miss out on starting their career, on getting those connections, getting the ramp up in their career that they were so hoping for. And the analysis showed, based on history of 1982 and prior recessionary time periods, that it impacted the net present value of their lifetime earnings. So people that are either not getting their summer jobs this year or not getting those first jobs when they graduate, that impacts their whole life.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's a massive structural change in our economy. The difference between this one and in 2008, the main problem was centered around two sectors. Real estate in one level and the financial sector. And when I say the financial sector, you can tag along some of the largest players like GM, for example, and Chrysler and Ford and AIG that tend to function like a lender. You remember GM used to own GMAC and
Yep.
all that stuff. And that represented 20%, let's say, of our economy maximum. In this cycle, the problem, it affects 100% of our economy. There is no business that is untouched. Even
Unless
if you
you're
think of,
selling testing units.
sorry?
Unless you're selling tests.
Unless
or personal equipment or masks.
In reality, even those, if you read recent articles, what's happening, that business relies on an individual to deliver the package from point A to point B. In the US, some of the individuals are walking away from the job because the money that they're getting, plus the extra additional money on the unemployment insurance, pays them more than what the company was paying them to deliver those packages. So they're also negatively affected. There is plenty of cases, and I suspect that will increase. And that's something the government did not plan on, saying, hey, if you're, I don't want to mention a company, but employee for the company that's into the delivery of certain packages or testing, and now you could get more money sitting at home unemployed for the next 2 months, and you're not at risk of COVID-19, because also people are nervous about getting infected, you will take that option and say, hey, I make the same money or I even more using that federal program. And that's a risk of these things. So that will push them to slow down into these cycles. But in this cycle, back to the original point, that almost every business is affected negatively. We started the earnings announcement by every company. I mean, there's few companies that it doesn't affect their business model because they're used to cloud-based, for example, sales cycle. They're going to make even a little bit more money, but those represent the 1% of the number of businesses out there. The 99% are going to be affected negatively.
Well, we're chatting with Hussein Ahmed, the founder of and CEO of Yorkville Asset Management, a money management firm, asset management firm, expert on the economy. We're going to take a break for messages and come back, and I'm going to ask him about bankruptcies and about when do we change things and start investing. So stay with us. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960 AM. We're chatting tonight with Hussein Ahmed, the president and founder of Yorkville Asset Management, and we've just talked through unemployment. We've talked through debt to GDP and what the government should be doing. And one of the other things that Hussein mentioned that he was very concerned with was bankruptcies. And Hussein, you know, I drive around town a little bit. I'm astounded at how many retail stores are closed, and of the restaurants, you know, maybe 10% of them are offering takeout. This is going to be devastating for small and medium-sized businesses, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The bankruptcy rate is going to spike up. I mean, most businesses have enough of a cushion for a month, let's say. You add to that a little bit of aid from the federal government, they can live a little bit longer. But in general, the bankruptcy is going to spike up. There was a report from an insurance industry that says insurance claims for business disruption total up about, from small businesses only, total about 450 billion a month. So you can imagine when we talk about the size of the aid stimulus, if this goes on for 3-4 months, just small businesses alone do not have enough stimulus to keep them going. So bankruptcy definitely will spike up. In the US, for example, there was almost 1 million applications for small business loans and grants. They've already used within 2 weeks almost 70% of that 349 billion geared for small businesses. And now they're looking to add another 250 billion. And we don't think 250 billion will bridge the gap in May. But the reality is, if they do not plan, there is no real plan for opening the economy, and this is going to go to July and August, you'll probably need another 500 billion. The same with the states. Each state, similar in the US or Canada and the provinces, the province deficit is going to widen quite a bit because of the cost to the healthcare system. So in the US, for example, they're asking for 500 billion in additional financing. In Canada, we expect the same numbers to be from the request from the provinces for aid from the federal government. So bankruptcies is a problem at all levels, small businesses and large businesses. The difference between them is in the large businesses, for example, like what we had with GM and Chrysler and AIG, the federal government is easier to provide the support. The number seems bigger from my point of view and your point of view, but the government can take a convertible debt, can take warrants on the business and recover that money 5-10 years down the line. In the case of small business, the government cannot take a warrant on a sole proprietor, cannot take a warrant on a restaurant. So it has to be really through a real grant of some sort or a way to delay expenses. Without that, obviously bankruptcies are on the rise, and they were already, individual bankruptcies and delinquencies were already ahead of the 2009 levels in 2019. So you can imagine in this cycle, we're going to surpass that number by a wide margin.
Now, I know you're a numbers person, economist. You, in your presentations, use a whole bunch of graphs. How do you track bankruptcies? Is it in number or is it in aggregate value of bankruptcies? And where do you see that going?
So that's a very good question, because in number of bankruptcies, alone is not indicative of, because somebody could be starting a business in January and goes bankrupt in March and he gets added as that. That's one aspect of it, but more the magnitude of the financial impact of a bankruptcy is important. So and that we can tell from payroll that's affected, debt that is in default. So when you start hearing about banks increasing their provisions for loan losses, those are expectations of banks not getting paid on these loans that they've extended. So JP Morgan announced this morning they have a drop in profit 69%, but the major reason is a spike in their loan provision for loan losses. So you got to take the two numbers together. The number alone is just an index of some sort, but its economical impact can only be seen from the financial side. A bankruptcy of a business of one is just one person getting laid off, and hopefully they have some sort of an insurance that pays them, or the federal government goes to rescue them. However, a bankruptcy of business that employs 500 employees, has loans, has mortgages, has different accounts payable to different suppliers, for example, it has a ripple effect on the economy. So you got to take two numbers together to get that assessment. And we're seeing a spike in both. We're seeing a spike in the number of people declaring bankruptcies and businesses in delinquencies, and we're also seeing all the banks increase their provisions, even with the federal government guaranteeing loans, the guarantee loan program. Still, banks are increasing the provision substantially. And on the other side, which we talked about last time, we've seen banks even raising rates on mortgages and other lending vehicles, not because the risk of you as an individual borrower who's paying now more is higher, but that is a risk premium to compensate them for those others that do not or cannot afford to pay that mortgage.
You know, I just feel ethically very different about this situation than the typical, recession. If you're running a restaurant and there's a recession and people have got less money, and so therefore for whatever reason you get less traffic and your restaurant doesn't do well, that's sort of business. But when a government orders you to shut down and says it's illegal for you to open and serve people, and that you're not an essential worker or an essential business, and all non-essential people can't be operating, I feel really different. Like the person doesn't deserve to go bankrupt.
Absolutely, you're right. And I think that both the provincial and federal government are in agreement with you. And that's why they're trying to give as many loans and grants as they could. In fact,
it's almost like you should be able to sue the provincial government or the federal government for your lost business because they ordered you to shut down.
There is clauses when there is pandemic, like many insurance clauses have exclude wars, an act of war, a pandemic. So the lawsuit, I don't think you'll have a lot of success in that venue, but I think what it is more the government understands what you're talking about, and they're increasing their funding substantially, and they'll continue to increase it because they realize that this is not a normal recession. It's not a business failure. It's not a drop in demand that was natural. This is forced drop in demand. You're forcing me to lay off my employees. And therefore, they will continue to increase the amount of fiscal stimulus. But at some point in time, they have to figure a way out of it. And at some point in time, they have to say, we provided enough help. We've spent 2 times or 3 times the amount of potential economic impact of this, and we can't rescue everybody. And that's our concern, is at what point in time they decide, well, we've done enough. At this moment, we don't think we're at this stage. At this moment, we think we're in phase 1 or phase 2 out of a 5-phase cycle. Historically, when we face these things, there's almost like 3 or 4 phases. This is a bigger problem, so you will see higher dollar amounts being pumped into the markets. The phases are becoming shorter in time between them. So, for example, to give you a perfect example, in 2007, President Bush passed the first Stimulus Act. And the end of 2008, it was President Obama that passed the second phase, and then in 2009, they passed the third phase. So there was a long time frame between phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. In this cycle, we've seen phase 1, phase 2, and 3 very quick, within, I would say, 2 months or even less. And now phase 4 and phase 5 that they're talking about will come in the month of May and June. So you're going to see more dollar amount, more phases, and the time between them being shortened because the magnitude of the problem. But I think I agree with you, and I think the federal and the provincial government is responding in a way that you and I want them to respond. The biggest problem is how do we administer, how do we give money to every small business owner without some sort of ownership, and who's going to be abusive and who's not. What business is going to, I receive, like everybody else, emails from every bank we deal with saying your business qualifies for these loans. Here's the 4 or 5 conditions. Fortunately for us, knock on wood, we don't need any of these loans. But out of curiosity, I look at what is the qualification, and immediately I say, well, my clients in this business do not qualify. My clients in that business do not qualify. My clients in this business. So you start going through it, but eventually it's going to get to the government that these businesses that are not qualifying today need to qualify because you're forcing them to shut down.
What about the real estate market? I saw the statistic that March this year over March last year was still okay, but the last 2 weeks of March were like a death spiral. What do you think is going to happen in real estate?
I think it's going to be tough. There is 2 things that's going to happen. One, in terms of the development that's occurring right now, everything is on hold. So if we planned for capacity utilization, that we needed capacity, everything is on hold. So a possibility that when we open up, we might face shortages and real estate market will pick up very quickly. The biggest problem is between now and that time, there could be 3-4 years where the shortages, because also people mentality is changing. So think of, we live in the city of Toronto, where condominiums is the biggest or on the fastest speed of providing that capacity. But after COVID-19, people are talking about, hey, the way that this is spreading is in areas where there is condominiums, where there is apartment buildings, where you get one person infected, spreading it to everybody in that building. So that might change the psychology of people. But for businesses who are developed in real estate, unfortunately, they're losing money today because all their projects are standing still. There is no development. For the consumer themselves, if they are in the middle, there's articles now in the news about people in the middle of a they sold their house and they're moving into a new house, but now they cannot move in. They're stuck in the middle. And mortgage rates are moving higher, not lower. So doesn't look good for that market for the time being.
And if you've got the unemployment levels that you mentioned, the bankruptcy levels you mentioned, the wage cuts that people are voluntarily or compulsorily agreeing to, you've got to have an impact on property values, don't you?
Absolutely. I would suspect a large number of the millennials will start moving back into with their parents. So fortunately, also we have a society that's fortunate and unfortunate. We have a society that's aging. Aging means they're more exposed to the COVID-19, but aging means their level of savings is higher than a society that's relatively average age being 34. So the millennials can absorb some of the shocks by moving back with their parents. The only difficult part is that if they just bought on a place and they lost their job, a $2,000 is not going to help them. An increase to the unemployment is not going to help them. They might have to sell this place, and that will push the prices lower, at least into the summer months.
We're chatting with Hussein Ahmed, the CEO and founder of Yorkville Asset Management. We're going to take a break and come back for a short conclusion. We're going to ask him, when's the time to change your attitude and look for opportunities? Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting with Hussein Ahmed, the CEO and founder of Yorkville Asset Management. Hussein, in the fall of 2007, Stephen Harper, who was the Prime Minister of Canada at the time, he got ridiculed for this, but said, you know what, this is a buying opportunity. He may have not had compassion and sympathy and understanding for what people were doing, but it was actually reasonably good business advice. When is the time to invest?
So, I mean, first of all, we talked about it last time, and I said the same thing. In every crisis of the sort, there's lots of companies that do exceptionally well, and you got to be ready and invest in them. This is where wealth really gets created. However, we caution people about pursuing a strategy that's suitable for them, for their age, for their retirement plans, for their risk appetite, because there's still lots of risks. We also caution that, say, markets in a bear market, you could see a cyclical short-term rallies, and these rallies tend to range between 10% to 24%. We've seen them in 2008, 2009 financial crisis. So you have to be very careful not to jump all in. The best advice that I can give to anybody is, you know, if you are sitting on a cash, this is a great buying opportunity, but at the same time, be patient. Do not jump in all the time at once. You can never get the bottom of that U cycle or the V-shaped recovery. Just deploy your money wisely. Bet if you're going to invest in companies that have strong cash flows that will survive this cycle or can generate income and grow in this environment, as opposed to the traditional companies that rely on debt to grow their revenues, because they're going to be handcuffed for at least 2-3 years, a lot of these companies. But it is right. It's a great buying opportunities. We've seen since we last spoke, markets are up good, I think 18%. We do believe markets have a certain pattern to them. And there's an economic or financial theory about this pattern. I'm not going to bore you and your listeners with it, but we do believe that markets are losing now that momentum after that rally, and we could see markets drop down again and touch the lows that we've experienced in March before kind of either breaking low on the lower side of it or deciding that this is the bottom and let's move, markets move higher. And the key to the determinant of all this is this COVID-19 and the fiscal stimulus. If there's 70 companies involved in looking for a vaccine, if one of them finds them, we can see markets rally aggressively. If the fiscal stimulus is expanded from $2 trillion in the US to $4 or $5 trillion, we could see that potential recovery being sustainable. And you have to remember that all markets reach a bottom almost 4 to 6 months before a bottom in that economic cycle. So if you think the bottom of the economic cycle is going to be in October, November, that means markets should start rallying in May, June, July. If we think it's going to be next year, the rally might not happen till November. So it all depends on these factors. But definitely there's a lot of buying opportunities. Think about it. If you liked Amazon before as a company, you should like them more now. That type of situation.
No,
I'd always suggest to speak to your financial advisors before making any of these investments.
Understood. Now, I know that you've been an investor in seniors housing. Seems like seniors housing has been really impacted by COVID-19. Is that still a good sector?
Well, we're investors in them. We originally entered in them under the Ministry of Health redevelopment program because we actually were among the first to say that the old model doesn't work. In Ontario, the number of Class C facilities, these are smaller facilities, smaller rooms, congested. We said Class C facilities is not the way. We should not have a third world kind of facilities in Canada. This is not a place where I want to be in. I don't want to put my parents in. And the fund was created to buy those Class C facilities and redevelop them into a Class A facilities. So many of the problems that you hear about tend to be more in the Class C facilities, and you hear about owners, and an owner could sue, an owner is negligent, and we wanted to get rid of that problem and say, no, these facilities should not exist in a country like Canada. So we were among the first to recognize this, and therefore, relative to the industry averages, we're fortunate that our numbers tend to be relatively lower than the industry average for the time being. I mean, the COVID-19 is not somebody's creation. It's not a competitive advantage. It's an unfortunate situation for anybody who's in the business. So that's number one on the fund. Number two, the nature of the business, when you talk about nursing homes, they tend to be for people who are older in age, and they tend to be with people who have severe health problems that you cannot send them home.
Yep.
So by nature, we all heard cases of people testing positive with the COVID-19, but it was like a flu symptoms, and they recovered. But unfortunately, this doesn't happen if you're 82 and you have already health problems, and you're sitting in a nursing home. So we have to be very careful in that. But I believe this proves Yorkville case since the beginning, that those Class C facilities and the number of beds, and we have shortages of beds per thousand relative to other countries, similar to the ICUs and hospital beds, need more attention. So we actually are very excited about the opportunity that this generates for us and our investors, because when you are saying these are not enough and Class C shouldn't be existing in Canada, and nobody's listening because everybody has other priorities, and you're number 200 on the priority list of any Minister of Health, it's hard to move up. Now, we are probably number 1 or 2 on anybody's priority list. So the fund purpose will be achieved faster. And I think all of us, not just from an investment, from a social, political, moral point of view, that we shouldn't have these Class C facilities in Canada. We should spend more money on redeveloping them to Class A. And that's the whole purpose of the fund.
Hussein Ahmed, Yorkville Asset Management. If people want to avail themselves of any of your research or your services, how do they contact you?
Most of our research is available on our webpage, yorkvilleasset.com. It's easy to remember Yorkville. So it's available online, and my telephone number, my email are on there. They're welcome to reach out to me. And I apologize if it's a little bit slow to reply. Just there's a lot of phone calls and a lot of meetings happening these days.
Hussein Ahmed, thank you so much for joining us on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour.
My pleasure. Anytime, Brian.
Good night. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. That was a fascinating conversation with Hussein Ahmed of Yorkville Asset Management. Here's my 2 cents worth. I think that this is in depression territory. I've never seen an economy like this. I graduated in 1982, and we had interest rates of, I think it was 18%. We had a slowdown in the economy. I lived through the 2007, 2008 Great Recession. I started doing a doctorate and started studying recessions at that time period. And how you get out of it. And this is far worse. The bankruptcies, I think, are going to be extreme. The unemployment is going to be extreme, and people's wage cuts that they're either forced to take or voluntarily taking are going to be extreme. And I think this is going to hit the real estate market. I think it's going to hit the office market. I think it's already hit the stock market. And I think it's going to hit people's lives. And so I think Hussein was right that we're going to see a second and a third fiscal stimulus from all these governments because they're going to come to the realization that the world is really negatively impacted economically as much as it has been from a healthcare standpoint. And the second emergency, which is going to be an economic emergency, is going to be as big, if not frankly bigger, than the health emergency that's already occurred. That said, dealing with the health emergency is the number one priority. So for whatever it's worth, I think that you've got to try to reinvent yourself in this new normal. You've got to try to figure out, don't just hunker down and wait it out. You got to try to figure out how you can make money, survive, if not, frankly, even prosper in a new environment. And I think that that's the key. And that has been, as Hussein spoke about, the result out of every other economic decline is that the people that think about new ways of making money, new business opportunities, and come to the realization that this new reality is the new reality, and they gotta figure out how to make money in it, or have a job in it, or not just survive it but prosper in it, are the people that make great wealth. So I don't know what the solutions are, but that's my suggestion to you. Anyway, good night. Thank you for joining us. We're on every Monday through Friday on Saga 960 AM. We're online at www.saga960am.ca at 6 p.m. Thanks. Good night.